This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ or sign up for our email list to stay up to date on everything we have going on. And to get the most involved, join our free Mighty Networks community to get connected with others living this restorative justice life all over the world. As far as this podcast goes, make sure you're subscribed, leave a rating and review, and share with a friend to help us further amplify this work. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Veronica, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I am a daughter of the diaspora. I am a friend, confidant, somebody who walks with their ancestors anytime they enter a room.
Who are you?
Someone who's guided by the personifications of nature, student of many mysteries, an ancestor in training.
Who are you?
Someone who still plays The Sims and is into comic books. A junior record collector. Someone who could be many other things if they wanted to. But I'm glad that I show up in the world the way that I do.
Who are you?
Someone who believes in the phrase, if you are the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Mm-hmm. Who are you?
A writer, a reluctant poet, community resource, community educator.
Who are you?
A constellation of my benevolent ancestors. Somebody who seeks to amplify the voices of those who walk with them. Guest on Lenni Lenape land for their whole life.
And finally, for now, who are you?
My late grandmother's namesake.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Veronica, so much for sharing all of those intersections of who you are. We'll be back with our full conversation right after this.
Hey folks, it's Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Veronica to the podcast. Veronica is a writer, educator, and connector at the intersections of Black identity, wellness, representation, and culture. She experiments with creative healing modalities and puts theories into practice and restorative practice. We're so excited to welcome her to the podcast, and without further ado, let's get right back into this amazing episode.
Welcome back, everyone. It is so good to be with you, Veronica. If you're someone who listens to this podcast weekly, last week we aired our live episode at the NACRJ conference. We had so many folks come and witness the conversation between me and a handful of folks. And Veronica was in attendance, and we talked after, like, yo, we got to get you on the pod. And so here we are later in the month, chopping it up. Thanks for rescheduling after, I was dealing with COVID, but it's always good to check in at the beginning of these conversations to the fullest extent that you want to answer the question in this moment. How are you?
I am doing pretty good. I am on the other end of what it feels like to get my second booster shot. So every time I get the shot, it's some other different reaction. So what I'm learning right now is how to continue to listen to my body and move at the speed in which my body communicates, like, nope, go lay down, or like try again, or like do a spin around the block, go buy another plant, refresh or alter, and then go do something else, and trying to find ways to. The beauty of these times means that we can, check in or work remotely. But the challenge with that is I'm finding with my eyes. So I tend to, for whatever amount of time that I'm looking at a screen, I try to offset that by looking at something else. So that's how I'm feeling today. More in tune with my body and trying to move at the speed in which she dictates that I can move, as opposed to my wishful thinking.
No, that's so beautiful. Even before the pandemic, I was very aware that, so much of my existence was staring at a glowing rectangle.
Uh,
Right, for connection reasons, for work reasons, for entertainment reasons, and that is not how humans were meant to spend their time. And I'm
mm-mm.
curious, you talked about a couple of the practices, but what are some of the things that you do to engage your body more?
Yeah, so the being a Sagittarius means that the stereotype of knowing where the party is correct. Now, whether I'm going to it is a whole other thing. And I am very fortunate, and this is a bit of a love language because my father, in his younger days, was a DJ. I would argue he still is. And one of the ways that I tap into that is by, or at least tapping into my body, is by following my DJ friends. Like, okay, cool, you're playing near my house. Okay, cool, I can come here. It's as safely as I possibly can be in all the ways in which I, as a Black woman, need to consider my safety. There's a reason why I only go to certain sets of friends that are playing. So obviously, I'm talking about dancing and moving my body. Making playlists is also another way that I can create different moods, right? So, like, if I want to be like when I have winter blues and I wish that it was warmer, I have a very tropical, like Back to the Future kind of playlist that I'll listen to. But if it's not movement in the sense of what I can actually do, sometimes just listening to the playlists that remind me of the different movement practices that I've used in the past that are always in my toolkit no matter what the world is doing. So, for example, if I really want to listen to something more meditative, then I have a playlist for that. But if I really want to zone out, this is gonna make some people laugh when they listen to this. One of the ways in which I can mentally detach from the world at times is to listen to capoeira music because I used to, it's 2022. Once upon a time, about 6 years ago, I used to train very heavily. And then a series of events meant that I did not train anymore. However, I still listen to the playlist and I still listen to the music. So hearing a beer and bow actually is very calming for me because when I trained in it, one of the things I learned very quickly is that you have to be out of your head. Like you cannot be in your head and like trying to dodge somebody's kick. Like that's how you get kicked in the face. And in capoeira, if you get hit by the person that you're playing with, it's your fault because you weren't paying attention to that person's body and what they were communicating with them, what they were communicating with their body. So for me, even though I haven't, and especially I don't know how people train in capoeira in COVID times. I still have not figured that out, but it's still very soothing to me to listen to it.
Yeah. For the uneducated, and I count myself among those, what is a beer and bow?
A beer and bow it's a pretty tall string instrument that has wood that's bent and then there's a string on it and basically it creates tension. And then you can take like either a coin or something else and you flick the coin on the string kind of like any other string based instrument and it creates a different sound. And depending on how tall the beer and bow is or short, it makes a different sound and how like there's levels to this. I never unlocked the level of like learning how to play. I was just, I was learning how to, do a mea lua and not, and land the right way. And a mea lua is what we would call a cartwheel. And one of the things is like you have to spread out your hands flat on the ground, otherwise like you're likely to break something. Because with capoeira, you're not using any weight. You're not using anything. You're using your own body as a counterweight to be able to sway and to move and to be in conversation with not just the person you're playing with, but what the beer and bow is communicating. Because there's different types of capoeira. There's regional, which is what I was training in, and then there's Angola, and then I believe there's another kind that might just be traditional. There's three. The one that I trained in was so that way I could know how to play with the other two. It was more in the middle, and by in the middle, it was communicating that it's in the middle speed wise. So Capoeira Angola is very slow and it's very to the ground. but then what we were playing was more upright. So the long and the short of that is the beer and bow dictates the speed. It's basically whoever holds that or whoever is the lead in the sound section is the one that's dictating how fast you're supposed to go or not, depending on who you're playing with.
Yeah, this brings up a couple things for me. Speaking about the NACRJ conference and thinking about like all the sessions that were going on, I'm thinking deeply. Oh, this just like brought up like my friend Beto's session that he did on the application to from capoeira to restorative justice. And I'm like, oh, we've got to get him on the podcast. And so thank you for bringing that in. And for everybody else listening, stay tuned for that conversation on a future episode. We talk about restorative justice and we were at this conference. You've been doing this work that we call restorative justice for a long time now, but also in ways that like don't necessarily flow with the words restorative justice. In your own words, how did this get started for you?
Yeah, so geez. Okay, so I've lived in New York City for 2022. I've lived here for 12 years now. I started my journey, and I started this by talking about my late grandmother, so this is about to weave all of that back. But I attended City College of New York in the CUNY system, which is our local public higher education system here. Studied international studies, culture and communication, history, which is a lot of words to say that I was learning how to show up in the world and how to hold space, and had professors that would make a point to have us sit in circle as opposed to, another power dynamic or configuration that communicated that they had power in the space, and that we weren't necessarily an active part. So shout out to Dr. Griselda Rodriguez Solomon for that experience in the class called Transnational Feminisms, which, if I'm not mistaken, she still teaches it, question mark, exclamation point. But I took that class in fall 2012, and that was the first full year after my grandmother had passed away. She passed away due to early onset Alzheimer's and dementia. Oddly enough, her death certificate didn't say that. It just said failure to thrive. That's important for later. And one of the things that I learned from how Dr. G, as a lot of us call her, facilitated our learning around different feminisms, and especially back then, because asking people's pronouns was not a thing. It really wasn't. And if it was, you had to be in the right class and you had to be unlearning gender in the first place. So I think one of the ways in which I got started was by being fortunate enough to not only go to academia but to graduate within a 4-year span, right? Like, that's one point of privilege. But the other side of it is in terms of how I got started from that class. Some folks I was in that class with and other people who had taken a previous semester of the class started something called the Sister Circle Collective, which ran from 2012 until 2017. So it ran for 5 years. And at first, our goal was to take some of the knowledges and some of the teachings, like around like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, like all of the scholars, and bring them outside of the class, not just for the people who they signed up late, but for people who were in the neighborhood of Harlem or Washington Heights, but did not go to City College for whatever reason. And then as we grew, we realized that there were a lot of folks who needed circle and they needed venting spaces. And also that was at a time where within movement culture here in New York City, this is the same flashpoint when Eric Garner was killed by the NYPD. Right? So there was a whole political wave. There was a generation of folks who were being politicized in that regard. And they used to discredit the value of what we were doing. Like, they just thought that it was just like a bunch of women and femmes like sitting around in a circle, like all the witchcraft memes, and just thinking about it of like, oh yeah, that's not really doing anything or whatever. And then we realized very quickly that there were a lot of fellow survivors in the room who were surviving things in real time. And I think that was around the era when I first started to even hear the combination of words restorative justice or conflict transformation or conflict resolution or all the other J's as I call them, because I was trying to find language for the feeling of, I'm not necessarily worried, with all due respect, I'm not worried about the cops. Not. Like, I have an expectation of how they're going to move because of how all the things, right? I'm more worried about the people that I'm supposedly in community with, that I'm supposedly in movement with, that are fellow BIPOC folks, but they're harming people. And there's no mechanism for change. And when I say harm, I mean any kind of harm, right? So whether it's just using them just for movement stuff and not necessarily because, like, that's a whole rabbit hole I don't want to go down. But within Sister Circle Collective, what we stuck to was trying to center healing as a part of our way of showing up in movement spaces. And then eventually, all of us who were steering that work, and it was a horizontally led project. By that we mean there was no vertical hierarchy. We were all in a steering committee kind of lane. And what happened was we ended up not necessarily being able to figure out a way forward. So some folks went on to, no, not some, all of us went on to do our respective things, and the things we brought to the table, we were just able to focus on that individually. And me focusing on, how I wanted to show up within healing and wellness turned into what we now call Ancestors in Training as a project.
I want to go back to, those classes with Professor G, right? What was it about that model of teaching that made you feel, oh yeah, this is it? Or like, I want more of this?
The days when whoever used her classroom before her would leave the room, scattered, like the desks and the chairs would be all over the place. So if you showed up to class early, one of your things was that you had to help, right? Not had to, but like eventually after a certain point, you already knew what the vibe was going to be. So you wanted to help reset the room or set the room for the day. And there would be some days where it would just be like life was lifing and we'd all just kind of be like, yeah, like what's the point of anything right now? But so I really have to say, like, that was the first time I had experienced like what circle keeping was without it actually being like, this is circle keeping, like, hello, like, here's a whole, it started here, it started here, it started here. And it was like, no, like, that's just the standard, that's the floor, right? So that way we can see each other and like we can actually get to know each other's names and like understand like who's speaking and like, or even community guidelines, right? Like, step up, step back. Like, I'm clearly a wordy person, so I, after a certain point in class, would kind of be, politely told, like, all right, Veronica, like, let somebody else speak, right? Not in a bad way, just like, that's just me as an academic, like, professor. That was the thing. Professors would be like, Veronica, you're good. Like, shh. But I'm trying to think what also was. Also to see Dr. G as like Afro Latina, like in that position to share knowledge with us. Like, I always said to myself back then that if I was ever a professor, I would want to be like how she was, because she was almost near peer. And I also think after a certain point, like, we would have certain flexibility within the class, so we could choose some of our adventure, right? Like, there were some parts that she was like, no, I have to do this because, this is an institution, this is where we are. But the other parts of it, she would say, like, okay, like, here's something that's happening in the world that's really relevant to this text that I need you to read for next week. Like, let's talk about it. Or let's just talk about something. Or also just asking us how we were feeling or what the text brought up for us. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I can't believe that was 10 years ago. I probably still have notes somewhere because the writer in me always keeps, if you ever give me a notebook, I will always have it. Now, whether I have it in this apartment, probably not, because I don't want to even count how many times I've moved since then. That's a tragedy. But it was the way that she held space for us and how she brought her whole self into that space. at a time where, unfortunately they were, and this still happens, like for Black folks who are in professor positions, they are not treated well at all by these institutions, but then they end up being the soul of whatever program or whatever department or class, and they're the ones that get talked about 10 years later.
Yeah. The ability to be seen and heard,
Yeah.
right, is different than one just being lectured at. Like, awesome knowledge that you're maybe getting from a professor who knows a lot. It reminds me a lot of, just to plug the episode that we did with Professor Daniel Rhodes, who I think this episode aired early July, talking about like the pedagogy of circle practice in specifically higher education, him being a social work professor, but like the ability for the students to turn to each other and learn from each other, right? See each other as teachers, as well as like, of course there's text that you have to read because like it's a class,
right?
And
There's
like
stuff you got to do in order to get the grade that you want. Like that's just the way that it goes.
But there is a way to make it so much more community driven and allow students to make connections for themselves when they're doing this work. Exactly. You took that feeling of being in class and with your comrades, like brought that to other community spaces. And I'm curious, like, some people are just like, oh, this is great, I love this, beautiful, cool, moving on. But right. Like, what was the thing for you that was like, oh no, people in my community need this too?
People kept showing up. That's like my standard, like in all of the ways in which I show up in the world or hold space. If people keep showing up or ask when the next one is, that is an indication to keep going. So I learned that from that era of like, okay, so and this is about as DIY as it could get. We would either A, rotate one of our apartments, or B, like somebody in community would let us borrow their space. Because again, like there's no budget, there's no grant, at least at the time. There's no grants for that kind of stuff. And then eventually we were able to get some limited funds to be able to offer free workshops, because eventually what would happen is we would host venting circles and healing circles, but then we were like, okay, what happens if we bring people who have skills and we offer space and time to those people to share their skills with people who may need to know or don't know that they need to know how to make their own, bug spray that doesn't have harmful chemicals in it, or like a healing through writing experience led by somebody who's a poet, right? Like there were summer series that we used to do with limited funding to be able to expand not only the type of work that we did, but actually to be active within our sense of community. And at the time, that was especially because most of us lived in the radius of City College, because even after we all graduated, most of us still lived over there. So it was easy for us to facilitate and do work up there. But then when we started getting a reputation, which is good, that meant that we had to venture out and be in collaboration with other collectives and other communities. And I think that was, I'll speak for me, that kind of branching out was helpful, because then when it became questions of like, what does it even mean to live in Brooklyn? I have lived in Harlem for 7 years. My father, when he immigrated from Guyana, St. Kitts, and Barbados, landed in Harlem. So Harlem is very dear to me, and I didn't really want to leave. And then somebody was like, no, Brooklyn is cool. Like, there's this space over here. There's these people over here. Like, Veronica, you would like this. Like, there were ways in which the community that we had built supported that transition. And I've been in Brooklyn ever since. So I clearly like it, even though I'm a reluctant, like, Brooklyn person now. Like, I've been here for 2017, 5 years. Eventually, my ratio of like how long I've lived in Brooklyn versus how long I've lived in Harlem is gonna cancel each other out. So we'll see how that goes.
You talked about how Sister Circle doesn't exist in the same way that it does. People have moved on to do the things. And one of the things that I like to think about a lot in this work is that like our initiatives, our projects don't always have to be like these long-lasting institutions
No, not
that
at
way.
all. Or like
Right.
it doesn't have to be institutionalized because we had that internal conversation of like, okay, if we become a 501c3, we could unlock a lot of funding. But do we really want the government in our business like that? This is before we figured out what LLCs were. And like also there were a lot of costs. There's a lot not were. There are a lot of cost barriers to folks who want to do this kind of work and want to show up in community, but they either have to do GoFundMe's. I'm like, one of the things that I've written about a lot is how so many people that I know, and even from the era when I first wrote it in 2017, are DIYing to survive and literally making these spaces because they know that like that is the space for somebody and that somebody needed that space, for whatever purpose that they did because they knew that they either couldn't find it somewhere else or B, they couldn't afford it somewhere else. So I think one of the ways in which I try to think that through is like we could have done certain steps or we could have taken certain paths and that might have been cool, but it wouldn't take away from the need that we had towards the end for us to sunset, right? And when I say that, I mean like, okay, like we had a very good run as a person who, is the techie oriented one, like making sure that the website still exists so that way people can look at it and like view it as an archive of like, this is what we did, this is a living, because depending on how you look at it, a lot of us are living archives. Not a lot of us. We all are living archives of those who came before us, right? So especially when you're doing such vulnerable work from a place of being invested in people's healing, like it didn't feel right to not pay for the domain. Still doesn't feel right. Like to this day, I'm like, nah, I don't think I'll ever take it down.
What you were doing was being responsive to the needs of your community,
Yeah.
right? And there's nothing that says like, hey, this circle space has to continue to exist for in perpetuity, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it is not in line with like the needs of one, the people who are
Mm-hmm.
benefiting it, but also like the people who are like contributing
Yep.
to making it happen. And I think oftentimes like in organizing spaces, and I think like in general, people get so attached to these ideas of like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, like this thing was there for me. This thing is something that I should continue to benefit from. This thing that should continue to exist because it did XYZ for me in this time and
Mm-hmm.
space. And I'm curious, like from the people, not the people who were in quote unquote leadership, but like from the people who were participating and coming into those spaces, like what has the impact of the sunset of this been on them? Like where have they gone from here, if you
Whew.
know?
Whew. That's a if I know question. Some folks who were steering that work, I'm still in community with. Some folks who used to attend, I feel like I kind of know, and I'm kind of in community. But that sound effect is because a lot of the folks that I met, actually, I can say it like this: a lot of the folks that I met towards the end I am very much like still in community with or have been able to collaborate with. So one of the people that comes to mind as I made that pivot of like, no, there's people from that era of my life that I am very much still in community with, like my friend Shira Share. They go by at Shira CNYC on the internet streets. And they were also a part of a collective at the time. And they too have since like moved on to doing, their own individual work. So, Shira and I kind of clicked around like, yeah, we just went through the same experience. Like we knew who we were in this constellation of people. And now we're in a space where we get to completely either A, like flip the table, start all over, or don't flip the table over, build or like put something new on there. So a lot of what got generated in that sunset were things that because I believe in this wholeheartedly, like you have to make room for things, right? Like you have
Mm-hmm.
to make room for blessings. Like it's not enough for you to pray or do whatever at your altar respectfully without actually letting go of some things. So now in hindsight, and again, I couldn't, it's one of those things you can't see it until you're well past it. I really thought that I was going to be doing that kind of work for a while, but then I realized that I'm still doing that work of like holding space for people. It's in a different way. And right now it's more ancestor and spirit led than anything else. And I move with, and that's a whole other conversation. I move with seasons. I go by what's keeping me up at night in terms of like holding space for it. So I can't really, the internet is a funny place because I can't really answer that without going into the archives or like without thinking about and naming specifically like people who are still my friends from that era of my life. But then the other part of me is like, I I really aspire for in general for people to be able to find whatever sense of community that they need to find. So I believe that folks who were a part of that era have moved on in ways that they needed to for their own healing journey. But I can't speak on a lot of that, to be honest. And it's
No,
not
no.
because I don't want to, it's just because like after a certain point our reach was pretty high, so I don't know. And I was like pre Instagram algorithm foolishness, right? And like we almost didn't have an Instagram because I was like who like what's the distribution of labor with that? Because if this just ends up being me, like so like I was very much like there's certain things that, and this is a circle keeping practice that I still do. There's certain things that are only for the people that are in the room. Not everything needs to live in the internet.
People will be okay. People will find their
Yeah.
spaces. Like you have to make room for the growth which you named, and like that's growth for them as
Hmm.
individuals, but like also like making room for the next thing for you. Speaking to like the internetness of this all, you did mention ancestors in training, which
Hmm.
has taken on lots of different forms. I encountered it as an Instagram account when I was initially like exploring this idea of like future ancestors as a concept to organize not just like restorative justice work of Amplify RJ, but in many ways like the words restorative justice are so limiting to like what this work actually is. And I think like
Hmm.
the words restorative justice are fine, beautiful, and useful for folks who are doing work in lots of different sectors, whether it's in school, the criminal legal system, bringing it into the workplace. And I do that, but what we're really talking about is living into our ancestral values and
Yep.
these ways of being. And when you log on to ancestorsandtraining.org, right, this idea of like 7 generations, it is key there. I'm curious, like, without now, I think I'm just going to ask you to like tell the story of like the genesis of like ancestors and training as a concept, and
Uh-huh.
like the different evolutions of what that has been over the past few years.
Okay, so in the in the in the twilight and the sunset of Sister Circle Collective, I the writer in me started to dig into different texts and different things that I found interesting because I had capacity for it. At that time, also, like, I was getting ready to organize a conference called Diaspora Radicalix in the Bronx. And one of the things that they asked me, they were like, I would love for you to do like some kind of healing experience, like healing through writing, because like that's my jam. But also like to figure out a frame for it. So I didn't necessarily have a frame at the time. And I it was one of those like it kept me up at night kind of things because I was reading a book by Yeye Louisa Tish, who has a book called Jambalaya. This phrase that I'm about to quote is not from that book, but every time somebody asks me this, I'm like, nope, she flowers for the living. She gets all of the praise. She has a quote that says, "We are the ancestors of the future, and what we do now will have an impact." And that found me in the collapse of the idea that I had in my mind of how I was going to show up in the world. Not anything else. Again, the ideas that I had of like, okay, I don't know what to do, or I don't know how to show up, or like what does it mean for me to hold space just as me and not necessarily as a collective body of people. And what happens when, you go from mourning that to being like, oh wait, like there's a freedom here, right? Like I can move in a way that I hadn't necessarily been able to move before, and I can move at my own pace and my own timing. So after that, I Googled ancestors in training. I realized that there weren't necessarily a lot of people talking about it the way that I wanted to talk about it. And especially to your point about socials and, trying to see who's doing what. Like, I wish people did that more. I wish people, when they had an idea or they had a concept or they had something, that they just took a look around to see like who's doing what and how they can literally be in community with people over, some kind of competition based type thing. So I really rooted ancestors in training that first round in December 2017 at that conference by asking questions that I wished I could have asked my grandmother, or things that I like, you know, especially because her memory started to go towards the end, like what names on the tree did she have? Like what things were gone? Like whole other separate podcast episode on what happened to or did not happen to my grandfather, right? So like there's so many different levels of like intergenerational trauma and the lack of potential for healing that happened in her transition, that I started to develop writing prompts that were things that I wished I could have asked her. And then eventually I started asking my grandmother, who's still living. And I started really, really building out my family tree, because I've had Ancestry as an account, and this is not a plug. I've had an Ancestry.com account since 2009. Like I've been trying to be the one to be like, okay, so what was this person's actual name, not their nickname, and where were they born? What about that? I've been that one on both sides of my tree. And what ended up happening was, after a certain point, I realized that there was a difference between first of all, as a person who is descended from enslaved Africans on both sides, there is only but so far that you can go. But I had this in my spirit to be like, okay, I want to know, just because one, I'm nosy, but also two, like I want to be able to say with authority, like, okay, like these are where my people are from, like these are where my people are buried, right? And if I don't know, like maybe there's another thread that I can pull to find out more, or like maybe there's questions that I can ask my dad that will help him recall a memory about his grandmother that ended up being like crucial to this whole question of like, where do you come from? Because a part of ancestral veneration overall, as a practice, as a religion for some folks, including myself, depending on where you fall in that spectrum, you have to know where you've come from in order to know where you're going. Right? And like within that practice, for me, I've learned, even then, I'm like, through the writing questions, because all of the prompts that live on Instagram have ever been asked in a circle ever are things that I've asked myself. So not just like, what is it, the higher order thinking of like, okay, I wish I could have asked my grandmother this. Okay, but now I'm going to ask my grandmother who's still alive. And then now I'm going to make sure that I ask myself this. That way I'm in integrity within this concept and this practice of like holding space for people to think about what it really means to understand that their time is finite, not from a place that's rooted in fear. Not fear based, but one that's more generative and an open palm that's like, okay, so cool, since we have this time, like what are we going to do with it? And then learning and listening to and reading and going down the rabbit hole of like ancestral traditions and like the different types of medicine that are out there, and the indigenous folks to the so-called Americas, right, that are thinking through like, what does it mean to look through the lens of doing whatever work that you do with the seventh generation in your lineage in mind. So
Yeah.
that's how that started. And it was mainly, me holding circles for people in real life. Again, a circle, like telling people like, yo, bring a notebook and an open heart, yelling on the yelling on the internet, pre-Instagram, not being just a photo-based app anymore. What a time. But and then holding space for people and like doing things seasonally. And then I was able to teach it to youth. Sadie Nash Leadership Project here in Brooklyn, which is an organization that services high school age youth, primarily young women and femmes, that has expanded since to include gender nonconforming folks and mages. And the youth are so like, I got it. Like, okay, this concept is amazing. One of the things that I've learned is like at times it's hard to explain it to near peers or elders, but youth are like, yo, I get it. And like then I go down like a Disney rabbit hole of like, yeah, so clearly Black Panther has some ancestral culture going on in it like the entire time. Like let's talk about it. Or like Moana and like Coco, which makes me cry every single time I watch it. And like thinking about the ways in which ancestral veneration does show up in popular culture and media or does not. And like, what does it mean when certain traditions get depicted one way and certain traditions that are not that far off or like are cousins get depicted in a more negative light? So I'm thinking about, how with all respect to the hive, I don't want the hive to come after me. I am a reluctant member of the hive. I'm more a Navy girl of Rihanna. But I remember when Lemonade dropped and everyone was like, oh my God, like, oh my God, like that. And like all the visuals to Oshun and all the things. And everyone was like, oh, she a child of Oshun. Oh my God, she has to be like that entire loop on the internet. But then also understanding that there were people who were like, oh yeah, I'm going to learn about this Orisha, da, 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 da. And then in the same breath be like, oh, but not that voodoo stuff. Like not what Haitians do. Like you can't talk trash about one tradition and then big up its cousins. You could totally do that, but I'm gonna have a lot of questions.
I mean, like everybody approaches, reclamation of ancestry in different ways. And we are limited by, in this land that we call the United States, one, our education, two, like even like knowing to go look for certain things. I remember very clearly at the 2017 NACRJ conference when I talked to Fania Davis at like towards the end of the conference about like, like as a Black person, as a Filipino person, none of my like I only have living grandfathers right now, and I don't have incredibly close relationships with either of them. And when I think about like connecting to ancestral past, like so much of that is like there are lots of like structural blocks to that. One, like the nature of the interpersonal relationships. Two, like Christianity. Two, U.S. imperialism and militarism.
Right? The number on everybody.
Right. And like, so like, where do I go is what I was asking her. And she was like, well, no, you just have to pray to your ancestors. And like, those people will find you. And you're not just thinking about like ancestors who are directly in your lineage, as important as that is, but there are lots of other ways that you can connect to these practices. And sometimes it's a Google search, right? like you were saying earlier, sometimes it is a Google search where thinking about like indigenous Filipino traditions, right? And like figuring that
because y'all have them.
Right. But what that led me to was this tattoo shop called Spiritual Journey Tattoo, like not that far away from where I live now. And like these folks, who are there, this tribe called Mark of the Four Waves, and the four waves of like immigration in the Philippines from the Negritos on into like Spanish colonialism and like American imperialism, and like reviving our ancestral ways through our tattoo traditions and storytelling and all of that. But like there are myriad ways that people are reviving these ancestral practices that like any of us can tap into, white people included. Like if you want to like put in the energy to learn, right? And like everybody like has a different everyone has a different path to that. And so when we're talking about, this podcast is called This Restorative Justice Life, right? We're
Right.
talking about ideas of restorative justice. And, if you're a longtime listener to this podcast, that we're talking about, ancestral values of interconnection as like the core organizing principle of who we are as people, whether the words Ubuntu or Kapwa or Mitakuyasan or Inlakech like are the words that like are of your people.
Yep.
These ideas exist for everyone. And part of that is like, of course we repair harm, but like we're also proactively building and maintaining relationships within our communities. What I leave out of that definition, but I often say in trainings with folks, like when we're building and maintaining and as well as repairing relationships, like the first relationship that you have is the relationship with yourself. So
Yep.
like, what is the work that you're doing to be not just like restorative justice practitioner, circle keeper, but like ancestor carrier of this work and this way of being? So you're tapped in. So you are caring for the relationship inside of you and that connection with the folks who have allowed you to be here, like just like period allowed you to be here, who have survived all of the struggle and trauma that have allowed you to be here in the space to carry on this vital work. How can people I just gave people a framing of like pray to your ancestors. And like this isn't about like this isn't like anti-Christian, anti-Muslim, anti-Judaism. Like you can seek answers from your ancestors without having to like deify them.
Right.
And however that works for you, that works for you. But prayers to ancestors, Google that shit, go to the library. How else have you encouraged people or invited people to tap into these practices through ancestors and training and in other ways?
Thank you for that. In the context of what happens when folks circle with me around the concept of how to be an ancestor in training as per what it means to me at any given moment, there is a living document called the syllabus of the same name. It's just the ancestors in training syllabus. I don't know how long it is at the moment, but there are books in there. There's movies. There's podcast episodes. There's what else is in there? There's links to past recordings. There's a lot of articles that a lot of people have written that I think are just good primers for folks that are just curious about like, what does ancestral veneration even mean? Like, when you say this, I hear this. How, girl boss culture has infiltrated the social media aesthetic of witchcraft. Like, there's so much in there. So I usually just go, whoop, and like just send it to people after they've circled. And I'm like, here you go, have fun, choose your own adventure. Or like, send me stuff that should be on there, which if this finds you and you think that there's something that should be on the ancestors in training syllabus, holla at your girl. So that's a concrete example. The other thing that I say to people personally, and I've tried to do a better job of saying this on the ancestor in training account itself, is how important mentorship is. Like, especially in this era of like all the internet scammers trying to be like, oh, like I had a dream about you and I needed to reach out to you. Like in an era of like people scamming in people's DMs in the name of, this really beautiful space that people are trying to be in, or trying to figure out what their ancestral traditions were, or like what kind of things they want to pass down, or what cycles they want to break. Mentorship is important. So that way you know what feels right in your spirit, what does not. If you have questions, you go to that person. In addition to mentorship, discernment is important too. Right? Like to be able to see, like, not only is a particular practice or a way of showing up for yourself that is in alignment with your highest good, is to just kind of sit with yourself to see, like, if keeping a cup of water underneath your bed, if that does anything for you energetically in the morning. If it doesn't do anything for you in the morning, does it make you feel like refreshed, or like some things, washed off of you, then you don't need to keep doing it. Right? Like you might be able to find something else that might be more of a release, or might bring you more clarity, kind of thing. Because the other challenge with this is understanding or trying to find things that were aligned or trying to follow the traditions that some of your ancestors did. But then after a certain point, if you've done the DNA test, you know that some of your ancestors might have got there in ways that are problematic or might have caused harm, especially if you are a descendant of enslaved Africans. Like that is the hello. Like if this reaches somebody and they're like, oh, like I don't know, like yeah, we got white ancestors. We do, right? And they did not get there most times in a way that was pleasurable experience, for lack of a better term. So one of the things that comes up a lot when I hold space is, okay, but when we talk about praying to our ancestors, which ancestors are included? Right? Who are we calling? Right? Because if are we calling everybody? Like even the ones that enslaved some of my other ancestors? Like what does that even mean, right? Or indentured some of my ancestors, like however you show up in the world, or just weren't necessarily living, righteously when they were on this planet, respectfully. One of the ways I think about that is I say or even at the beginning of this, I said I'm a constellation of my benevolent ancestors, right? Like I'm a personification of them. Benevolent meaning wishing the best for me, whatever your ancestral veneration practice, tradition, whatever you want to do, please know that it is an active relationship, right? Like we're talking about restorative justice being a relationship and how we're in relation with other people. Do not get transactional with your ancestors. Please don't do it. Don't only go to them when you're in a crisis or you need to know whether or not somebody loves you or not. Don't do that. Or if you're gonna do that, please be in a consistent relationship with them. Don't only go to them when you need or want something. That's and the aspects of which that's a relationship is doing simple things okay, Veronica, know that through asking my father what my late grandmother's favorite flowers were, they were roses. So on her birthday and on the day that she transitioned, she gets long stem red roses. So I go do what I need to do, go find the nearest vendor or whatever, go sit there, refresh it, cut all the leaves off so that way they don't fall in the water and then make the water icky. That's a hack. And then just talk. Or one of the things that I say in terms of all of the ways in which I show up in the world, one of the root questions that happens is I wonder what they would think. People that I've lost, or depending on how you look at it, people that I've gained in my ancestral court. I'm what would they think of what I'm doing right now? Would they be proud of me? I would think that they would be proud of me. And if I'm doing something that wouldn't make them the proudest, or would make them go, try that again, what can I do to be in better, as you said, all of this circle keeping, holding space, all of these practices, they have to include us that are holding space for other people to navigate those things, or how to potentially build it better into interpersonal relationships with some of the folks that they still have here, or to ask questions that are a little tricky or a little complicated, especially if you come from a diaspora where in order to assimilate you had to lose a language, or you had to lose a certain cultural practice, or you had to lose an accent just to be able to fit in, because the world is cruel at times. So I think that there's so many different ways and lanes in which people can return to that. And also, just to echo what you said earlier, white folks, y'all have traditions too. The way that white supremacy worked is that it practiced it on itself, right? The Greeks and the Celts and all these movies that they put out. There's so many things, and the fair, I'm there's so much that we black and brown people have to quote unquote learn about some of the ancestral traditions of white folks. And I'm which is a whole other thing around whether people who are not of the particular tradition, it's origins or roots, can practice that tradition itself. That's another podcast. It's a whole other thing.
What are other invitations or steps that you want to invite people to take to continue to engage in the work with you or just in general?
Follow us on Instagram at Ancestors in Training. All one word. Check out our website because and by we, I mean me and my ancestors, update it with like, here's what's happening, or here's what we've done in the past, or like, especially in moments like right now where we're not technically doing anything actively, but we will be in the future. So, like I said earlier, I plan in seasons and in ahead or in advance of whatever season that we're in. So right now I'm thinking about how I want the project to show up for the rest of the year. And that's the other thing too. Invite me to spaces, like talk to me. Like if this really resonates and you're like, I have a community of people that would really enjoy hearing from you, just DM me. Like while my DMs are calm. If you've ever circled with me and this is the nature of the game, like affirmations of the work. Like written testimonials are cool because that also helps me bring the work to other folks, or when folks are like, well, what does it even mean to circle with Veronica?
After Veronica and I finished our recorded conversation, we got into talking about how the Amplify RJ community and the Ancestors in Training community could come together and collaborate. What was born of that conversation is this fall course that we're launching, Preserving Our Histories, Sustaining Our Legacies. It's going to be on Sundays from September 4 through October 23 from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific, 12 to 3 p.m. Eastern. Over the course of the 6 weeks, participants will explore the intersections of intergenerational trauma, representation, ancestry, histories, healing justice, social justice, community care in their lives and in their community. They'll use oral history techniques as a tool to archive their traditions and family histories while cultivating and developing their self and community care practices. Veronica has facilitated this learning in numerous spaces before, and we're so excited for her to bring it to our community with Amplify RJ. In order to strike the balance of sustainability for her and accessibility to the community, we're inviting people of the global majority, including Black, Indigenous, people of color, including those of Asian, Middle Eastern, Latina, and mixed descent, to join us for a one-time payment of $500 or 4 payments of $125. If you have any questions, reach out to us at info@amplifyrj.com or veronicaagard@gmail.com. Now, it's time for the questions that everybody answers when they come on this podcast. So, in your own words, define restorative justice.
Restorative justice seeks to find ways to be in right, or as close to right as you can get, relationship with other people, especially if harm has been caused. And at the root of all of that is consent. Like consent stops it before anything can go any further. Like before a process can happen, like both parties have to agree to it. If one doesn't, that's it. It's also a way of holding space for people that is so old. Like the combination of restorative and justice, to some of our ancestors, they might be like, what are you even talking about? Right? But like they might have had a tradition or a way of keeping space and holding space for people who have been harmed and or have caused harm in a way that wasn't punitive, in a way that centered people's humanity.
As you've been doing this work, what has been an oh shit moment and what have you learned from it? So often like a mistake or something you wish you'd done differently.
And this is the challenge with any kind of circle keeping at all, but like you have an agenda and you have a flow, and like it's both versions of this. Like, oh shit, like that was really profound what that person shared, and I want to go on that tangent of what they shared, versus the other side of that where like, like the person shared something that even threw you off as a facilitator. So I think that most of my moments have been like, okay, like I had a flow, I had an idea of how this was gonna go, and like either way, its swings can happen. Like we deviated a little bit too much, and now we don't have time for the other things that I wanted to get to, or like nope, we can pivot. Like I'm here for this kind of pivot. So I think that that's That's happened to me.
I guess, like, what is the learning?
The learning is to continue to be adaptive and to continue to be teachable from those kind of moments, especially when folks like when I'm holding space for them around ancestors in training will drop a book or drop some movie that I've never heard of, and I'm like, wait, like world stop, like hold on. like I need to add that immediately, or I need to watch it and like screen it or do something, to be able to continue to stay like a student.
Absolutely. That was also like, the coffee's wearing off moment. Time to refuel. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they, and what is the question you ask the circle?
My paternal grandfather, Prince Rogers Nelson, aka Prince the artist. Octavia Butler. What else would I put in? The eldest branch of my family tree on my mother's side I ever found, Elizabeth Harper Glover. Those are the 4 people I would put in there.
And what's the question you would ask the circle?
What do you want your legacy to be? Like that is it's a oversimplification of a feeling of just, not only wanting to hear what they say, but just like I chose those 4 people because I believe in like blood ancestors and I believe in chosen ancestors, and in the ways in which both of those have influenced my work. That's why I chose folks who are no longer with us but have influenced me, and folks that are no longer with us but are a part of me.
The beautiful part of this framing is now I get to turn it back to you. What do you want your legacy to be?
That I made choices with the future in mind, that I moved in a way that created different kinds of wealth for those who come after me. And when I say wealth in that sense, I mean love, I mean care, ways of being outside of all of the isms in the world that I wrote for my life. Like not just for as in like a practice, but also like wrote for my life in service of what I wanted it to be and what I needed to create it to be. And that they, through me, have the power to literally create their own world. Because when I'm gone, that's what I aspire for them to call on me for. And that there's someone on Instagram who goes by Hey Alafia, and Alafia is their name. And something that they said is that the way that you move through the world now, and how to be kind and how to move through the world with love and like just being a good human and keep good character, that is how the light behind your photo on the altar stays bright or stays lit. So ever since I saw that, I was like, whatever I got to do to be able to keep a spot on my future descendants' altar, like whatever that is, that's what I need to be doing. To be able to create different kinds of generational wealth that don't have to do with capital. That's what I overall want my legacy to be.
There's a way that we think about like legacy that's like, Alexander Hamilton, like who lives, who dies, who tells your story. That's like a lot rooted in ego.
Yeah.
And on one level, I'm like, of my blood ancestors who lived even like 4 generations ago, how many of those names do I know? How many of those people can I look back on and say like, yeah, like That's cool. Like I also have like the ancestry. I know 16 great grandparents. I know 16 great grandparents, like all 16 of my great grandparents, the names of all 16 great
Mm-hmm.
grandparents. And that's thanks to my mom's mom and my dad doing, and like one of my aunts like doing a lot of that work. But like beyond their names and whatnot, like I don't know. I don't know what they did. I don't know like their marks on the world. And like
Mm-hmm.
part of me is just like, it's not for me to determine what my legacy will be. Like I just want to like live in the best way. How do you navigate like the ego-ness of it all
Mm-hmm.
versus like this is just the way that I want to be in the world, and whatever happens, however I'm remembered is what it is.
Yeah, I think I appreciate that. There's a duality here of like all of the things that we're doing in the present moment shape the future. But also, we can't control that. So we have no idea what it is that, somebody is going to remember me for, right? Because they're probably going to find either my words or something else, or they might even have different language by that point for like what it is that I do, that again, here in the present moment, we have no idea what's going to happen. So for me, I think the way that I surrender to that kind of ego-based thing is like to surrender to the idea that I can control that outcome of like if I do this plus this, that they'll call on me for that. Like no 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 no. Like I aspire for them to like I aspire by living a certain way and like doing the best that I can with what I have, that they'll call on me. Like and that's all that to call on me at all. Right? Like that's the way that I surrender to the ego based part. And I think it's hard just because of the times that we live in too. Right? And like just like this idea of like it's nice to be recognized at times, and there's nothing wrong with that feeling. But if we stay in that feeling too long and we only do things for I'm thinking of the Chronic song, like we only do it for the likes, right? Like if we only do it for the affirmations of other people, then we'll never really be as whole as we could be or as fulfilled as we could be. So it's hard too, because then especially in the sense of like egos, because then it's really hard in the ways in which cis het white supremacy capitalism operates to see anything outside of yourself and to like be doing things like not only outside of yourself and like your people, but like the environment, like the planet, like the world, the all the creatures that we're in relationship with. Like it's really hard to move forward in that way. So I think the way that I move past ego is letting go of a particular outcome. It's not easy though.
What is one thing, it could be an affirmation or a mantra, that you want people to know?
It's something that my mother says very often because my mother was an educator here in the New York City public school system in Harlem. And one of the things that she says very often is that everything is an extended deliberate practice. So the way that I have flipped that and internalized that is that every day I'm in an extended deliberate practice of being myself. Whatever that means to me at any given time. Sometimes it means one thing, sometimes it means something else. Sometimes I pick up something from a toolkit of healing, sometimes I put something away. And figuring out whatever it means for you to be in an extended deliberate practice of being yourself will allow you to show up however it is that you show up in the world in the most authentic and aligned way possible.
Where can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
For folks that want more resources on restorative justice in general, I have the privilege of being the communications associate at Restorative Justice Initiative NYC. There's a lot of resources on there. We have a weekly digest that I get to curate and make sure that there's resources and job opportunities and RJ in the news and events and all these things. So that would really be cool if folks want to learn more about that. In terms of ancestors in training, it's the same kind of thing, following us on all the platforms to see when we're going to do something next, and being a community to see how we can be in relationship with each other.
There you go. All of the ways.
All the things.
Links in the show notes. Veronica, thank you so much for being here with us on the podcast. We'll be back with somebody else living this restorative justice life next week. Until then, take care.
Thanks, Veronica. I know that in the past I've kind of challenged this idea of what ancestry can be, but I thought that this was really important. Ancestry, as I've said before, in my estimation, is by connection, not necessarily by blood. As someone myself, again, who I can't track back my ancestry, I can't even track it back one link. So acknowledging that ancestry can be out of love and not by blood, I think is a really important layer to the conversation of ancestry. But I also really appreciated how she emphasized the importance of ancestry as a way of not only understanding like where you come from, but also just an understanding of self. Understanding of self in relation to others and in relation to the world depends on understanding a little bit more about your roots. And I really appreciated how she emphasized how important that exploration can be. As you continue on your restorative journey, I encourage you to seek a little bit more about your ancestry and not just the people, but also the culture that surrounds that. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. Or if you're old school, tell a friend. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, signing up for a community gathering, workshop, or course. So many options. Links to everything in the show notes, or on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.